On a cold winter evening, Mason heard something unusual sounds at his door. The sharp wind carried a faint cry, and as he reached the door of his cabin, he came face to face with an unexpected guest. A wild bobcat stood just outside his porch. Her amber eyes stared at him with a mix of wariness and need. Her fur was wild and thick, yet her ribs showed through, indicating the difficulty of her journey. Behind her, two cubs huddled together, their little bodies trembling from the cold. Mason stood frozen. His first reaction was one of disbelief. A bobcat, and with cubs at that. This was a situation unlike anything he had ever encountered. But then, as he watched, the bobcat lifted one paw and gently placed it against the glass of his door, as though asking for entry. Mason hesitated, surprised by the audacity of the creature. He had heard tales of wild animals seeking shelter in harsh weather, but seeing it in real life was something else entirely. He opened the door just enough to let warm air escape into the night. The bobcat stayed still, her cubs pressed close to her. Something about her gaze urged Mason to act. Ignoring the cautionary thoughts in his mind, he fully unlatched the door. To his surprise, the bobcat entered slowly, her cubs following in tow. The chill from outside swept in, but he quickly shut the door, locking out the cold. Her fur held patches of frost and her cubs shivered visibly. She shook herself off, droplets of moisture splattering onto the wooden floor. Mason stood at a safe distance, unsure of how to proceed. The bobcat sniffed the air, and her sharp gaze scanning the room. Her cubs clung to her legs, their soft mews filling the silence. Mason's heart softened at the sight. Whatever had led them here was clearly dire. He stepped into the kitchen to prepare something warm, though he had nothing specifically for wild animals. He found some leftover chicken, warmed it slightly and placed it on a plate near the bobcat. She sniffed the air, approaching cautiously. Her cubs followed, but she nudged them back and inspected the food first. Once she was satisfied there was no threat, she began eating, her cubs joining her after a brief hesitation. As he watched, Mason noticed her swollen belly, and he found that she wasn't just a mother of two, but also pregnant. This explained her boldness in seeking refuge. He marveled at the trust she exhibited by allowing him near her cubs. Despite her wild nature, she seemed to understand he meant no harm. As the evening wore on, Mason became mesmerized by his unexpected guests. The cubs began to explore as their curiosity overcoming their initial fear. They tumbled over furniture and their tiny paws slipping on the hardwood. The mother bobcat kept a close eye on them, while her ears twitching at every sound. Mason smiled at their antics. As the night grew darker, the snowstorm outside intensified. Mason quickly gathered blankets and an old mattress to create a cozy bed for the bobcat family near the fireplace. The mother bobcat approached the bed slowly, sniffing the fabric with caution. When she seemed satisfied that it was safe, she curled up and her cubs snuggled close to her. Mason stood back, quietly amazed at how effortlessly they settled in, as though they had always been a part of his home. The next morning, Mason woke to find the bobcat still resting in her corner, her cubs nestled against her. She watched him carefully as he moved around the house. He decided to check with his neighbors to see if anyone had encountered the bobcat. He clicked few pictures of Bobcat and ventured into the snow. The neighborhood was quiet, blanketed in white. He knocked on several doors, showing the photos to anyone who answered. Most were stunned to learn of the bobcat, but none recognized her. One neighbor suggested calling animal control, but Mason rejected the idea. He couldn't bear the thought of separating the mother from her cubs, especially under the circumstances. Returning home, Mason searched online for any reports of missing bobcats or local sightings, but found nothing. The more he thought about it, the more he felt an obligation to care for them. They had come to him for help, and he was determined to see them through. Over the next several days, Mason adapted to life with his unusual guests. He bought raw meat and other supplies to ensure they were well fed, and even set up a small litter area. The mother bobcat remained cautious but began to trust him more. She allowed Mason to get closer, even letting him clean around her without objection. One evening, as Mason prepared dinner, he noticed the mother bobcat acting uneasy. She paced the room, her ears pressed back and her tail twitching. It dawned on him that she was going into labor. Mason quickly made her as comfortable as possible, adding more blankets and dimming the lights. The birth was quiet, save for the soft cries of the newborn cubs. Mason kept his distance, respecting her need for space. When it was over, she lay exhausted but proud, her new cubs nursing at her side. Mason admired her strength and resilience. The tiny cubs, their fur damp and eyes closed, were perfect. As weeks passed, Mason's home became a sanctuary for the bobcat family. The older cubs grew more adventurous, exploring every corner of the house. The newborns stayed close to their mother, their tiny cries filling the space. Mason, enchanted by them, bought toys and climbing structures for the older cubs and researched ways to ensure the bobcats' well-being. Despite their wild instincts, the bobcats adapted to life indoors. The mother remained vigilant, always watching Mason, but her trust in him was clear. She allowed him to approach her cubs and even accepted food from his hand. In return, Mason respected her boundaries and worked to create a balanced living space for them. The snowstorm has finally stopped, but Mason knew he couldn't simply release the bobcat family into the wild. The cubs were too young, and the mother still needed time to recover. He consulted with a wildlife expert who advised him on how to care for them until they were ready for reintroduction. Months went by, and the bobcat family became a cherished part of Mason's life. The older cubs grew stronger, their playful behavior brightening his days. The newborns opened their eyes and began exploring their surroundings. The mother remained the heart of the family, her presence commanding respect. Mason often reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful winter night. His once quiet home was now filled with the sounds of life. The bond he had forged with the bobcat family was unlike anything he had experienced. They had come seeking refuge, but in the end, they had given him something much more profound, a sense of purpose and connection. As spring approached, Mason began preparing for the next chapter. He worked with wildlife experts to ensure the bobcat family could safely transition back to the wild. It was a bittersweet process, but Mason knew it was the right choice. He built an outdoor enclosure in his backyard to help them adjust to life outside. The mother bobcat took to it immediately, teaching her cubs survival skills. When the time came for them to leave, Mason opened the enclosure and watched as the mother led her cubs into the forest. She paused at the edge of the trees, glancing back at him one last time. Mason raised his hand in farewell, his throat tight with emotion. With a flick of her tail, she disappeared into the wilderness, her cubs close behind. Mason stood silently for a long time, enveloped by the quiet of the forest. He felt deep gratitude for the time they had spent together. The bobcat family had left an indelible mark on his heart, and he knew their memory would stay with him forever. In the months that followed, Mason often looked out into the woods, wondering how the family was faring. He liked to imagine the mother bobcat teaching her cubs to hunt, their wild spirits thriving in the freedom of nature. Though they were gone, their presence lingered in his home, in the toys they had played with and the memories they had created. Mason's life returned to its peaceful routine, but it was forever enriched by the experience. The bobcat family had taught him the value of trust, compassion, and the deep bond that connects all living things. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled outside, Mason would smile, remembering the warmth and love they had brought into his life. If you love this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss out on more heartwarming tales like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.